Welcome to this installment of the Commonwealth of Learning's interview series. I'm Jako Olivier, Advisor Higher Education at the Commonwealth of Learning. Joining me today is Rebecca Ferguson, a Professor Emerita at the Open University UK, who focuses on educational futures, learning analytics, online social learning, augmented education, and microcredentials. So, Professor Ferguson, the concept of microcredentials is understood in many different ways, and there are also definitions from the Commonwealth of Learning and UNESCO that provide some idea of what it entails. How would you describe microcredentials?
I agree. There are multiple ways of describing it. In our recent book, Denise, Whitelock and I pick out, I think, 4 key characteristics. We'd say they're short pieces of learning for which you receive some form of acknowledgement, perhaps in the form of a badge or a certificate or a credit. They're usually online. They're not always online. And the emphasis is on the needs of the workplace. Now, other definitions go into a lot more detail, and they usually have some sort of focus. So some people are giving precedence to the academic aspect, some people to the workplace aspect, some people to a focus on competencies and skills. It depends on where people are coming from, why they're writing that definition. I think the most detailed one is coming out of the European Union at the moment, which is linking microcredentials into all its pre-existing frameworks, which I think is proving quite helpful for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. You mentioned the book Microcredentials for Excellence, a Practical Guide, which was published earlier this year, and co-chair Professor Denise Whitelock was also involved in that. In that book, you refer to a pedagogy of microcredentials. How do you think this would be relevant to open and hybrid universities within the Commonwealth?
I think when you're putting a micro-credential together, the first assumption from people who aren't involved in putting courses together tends to be that you could take a normal credential and you can chop it up into pieces. So you've got, say, a 60 credit credential, and you can chop that into 4 15 credit ones, or you can chop it into 6 10 credits. But of course, that's not really quite how education works. Things build on each other. Students develop skills and they build those up. And so, for example, something a first year undergraduate studies in their first term is not the same as what a final year undergraduate studies just before they graduate. So it's worth thinking that there's more to it than that. And also thinking about how your learners are different. A micro-credential might have a very large cohort, but it might have not very many educators to quite a lot of students. So you've got to think about a pedagogy which works in that way. Your students aren't full-time students, so they're going to have work commitments, they're going to have care commitments. They're not prioritizing their studies in the same way that a full-time student would be doing. They may be learning online for the first time, so that's a bit daunting for them. They don't necessarily know quite how to go about it. But we also have to bear in mind that unlike undergraduates, they've probably got substantial work experience. So they don't want to be treated as complete beginners in many ways. So there's lots of aspects of the learners that you need to take into account when you're doing this. You also need to take into account that they may not have studied for quite a long time. And when they did study, they may not have been as successful as they wanted to be. So it's useful to build in some self-regulation skills, by which I mean things like encouraging your students to set goals, giving them some learning strategies that they might want to make use of, giving them advice about how to reflect on learning, how to evaluate their learning. You might also want to just point them in the direction of some fairly basic study skills for an online learner, things like the allocation of time round their work and their caring capabilities. You might want to encourage them to find a good workplace and to think about well, where can I study without being interrupted? Where can I be online where I know that the internet is going to be good for me? Where am I going to keep all the notes that I make? So those things are important. Going more deeply into the pedagogy, there are some pedagogies which are particularly aligned with work-related learning. So, for example, competency-based learning, which is very much aligned with clearly defined competencies, and you're getting your learners to progress through those competencies, demonstrate one before they move on to the next. Or you might get them to do case-based learning. That's a sort of guided inquiry learning, very much with the focus on being able to put these skills into practice in the workplace, not letting your students go too much off topic, guiding them back if things start to go wrong. But really acknowledging that they know about some of these things. They don't need to start necessarily right at the beginning. And as a group, as a cohort, they've got skills that they can put together just as they would in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree with you, and I think it's very important from the Commonwealth of Learning's perspective to emphasize how this learning should be very much contextualized, not even at the country level, but very much at an institutional level in terms of the medium and the modality. Do you think micro-credentials actually can be of support in this open distance learning environment? Does it add something extra, or is it merely just another way of credentialing? It will not have an effect on the fact that how we actually approach open distance learning at all.
I think it depends. I think it brings more people into open and distance learning. I think open learning, micro-credentials gives us a way of credentialing that perhaps we didn't have in the past. And I think one of the things that has sometimes put people off open learning is, yes, you go in there, yes, you do the learning, yes, you acquire the knowledge and the skills, but then you can't demonstrate them to anybody. You can't prove that you've got them. So I think very important in the open context. And in the context of distance learning, obviously since COVID, we've seen more and more people moving into distance learning, and just having those chances to compare your work with others, to develop those skills, and to give awards for that, that's very important as well.
Yes, thank you. Linking up with that, your publication also envisages expanding learning opportunities and strengthening employment-related learning through using micro-credentials. To your mind, what should Commonwealth governments prioritize in this regard?
So thinking about that from a government level, I mean, obviously a government is being very strategic, so they're not thinking about the practicalities of how this works at a course level. So one of the things the governments need to think about is what they are trying to achieve with micro-credentials. And as I said at the beginning, people understand micro-credentials in different ways. I think some countries have thought about this in some detail. For example, Malaysia's got an education blueprint. It wasn't necessarily designed with micro-credentials in mind, but micro-credentials align with it very closely because they're thinking about strengthening technical and vocational education. They're thinking about closer links between academia and industry, academia and the community. And in Europe, I mean, Europe, not the Commonwealth, but still, the European skills agenda has a lot of impact worldwide. And there again, is thinking about can you develop applied skills for the workplace? So at that sort of level, thinking about what you're trying to achieve, and then beginning to think about also how you're envisaging the micro-credentials. So Beverly Oliver, who's a Professor Emerita in Australia, did a lot of work, or still doing a lot of work, around micro-credentials. And so she suggested there's different things that they can be doing. So there might be a route into a degree for people who perhaps haven't moved into higher education before. But they might be used to certify experiences you've had, which isn't in an HEI institution. They might be used to certify additional expertise that you bring to a job or to a qualification. They might be used as a skills update. So you might be in a job, you might be in a profession they're linking up with CPD, or they might be telling employers about your personal attributes, your skills, your competencies. So that's something that I think at government level, governments need to be thinking about. Well, what do we really want to do with these? You know, do we want to do all these things, or do we want to go down one of those routes much more than others? I mean, whichever route they go, they're going to need to integrate with their existing national structures, qualification frameworks, educational frameworks, quality assurance frameworks, and with the international ones. And they might be thinking about, well, those now need to be updated a bit. You know, some of those frameworks are beginning perhaps to look a bit old because they didn't take micro-credentials into account. They perhaps didn't take distance and open education into account. And also paying attention to equal opportunities and inclusion, the sorts of policies that underpin lots and lots of work, but you need to build them specifically in every time you think about a new project. So when you're thinking about micro-credentials, thinking about how they can really increase inclusion in education and opportunities.
No, thank you. Thank you for the comprehensive answer. I think what I want to ask next also links up with that. The Commonwealth of Learning has recently started with the project developing a Commonwealth Credit Transfer Framework, Microcredentials in a Digital Age, of which you are aware. In this project, we aim to go through a research-based and consultative process to get inputs across the Commonwealth to take a snapshot of what is taking place in terms of microcredentials, and then also collaboratively come up with a framework for credit transfer and microcredentials. In your mind, apart from what you've already mentioned at national level, what do you think would be required to set up such a framework, especially for it to be implemented at regional? In some cases, I'm thinking of the Pacific and the Caribbean areas, but also at a national level for other member countries. So what do you think would be required for such a network, for a framework that is?
I think as a starting point, it needs a vision. It needs to say, you know, in 5 years or in 10 years, this is what we will have in front of us. And that we need to think about where we're going with the credit transfer. So is the credit transfer within an HEI institution? Because sometimes people just want to be able to move, you know, they've studied a micro-credential in one faculty, they want to move it across. We're probably not looking at that level, but we might want to be looking at moving between HEI institutions, either in the same country or in different countries. I mean, ideally, we'd be able to do that internationally all the way around the world. Do we want people to be able to bring credit into a university course? So rather than starting right at the beginning to say, well, actually, I've got these knowledge, these skills, these competencies. Here is a micro-credential proofs I've got them. Perhaps I could miss out, you know, this part of the course. On the other hand, do we want them to be able to take credits out with them to say, okay, I've studied 3 micro-credentials here, but actually I now want to go somewhere else. I want to take them with me. Do we want the transfer to happen beside universities? I mean, a lot of the literature and a lot of the assumptions say this is about higher education. But actually, the definition of micro-credentials doesn't say they have to be a higher education level. And if you think about some of the things that people relate them to, the skills and the competencies, you know, you don't necessarily need to be working at undergraduate level to say, you know, I can work as part of a team, I can collaborate with people, I can be creative. So you might want to do things alongside HEI and say, yes, I've got a credential, but it's not a university credential. Or you might want to prepare to move into a university. So you're putting together some credentials. You're thinking about, do I want to study at this level? And then can I move them from into a university, or can I move them into employment? Or are you doing this completely separate from universities? You know, you're working in a tech job. You don't particularly want a degree. What you want is the proof that you can, you know, work with a particular package, or that you've got experience of developing a project. So you might be going for something which is certified by Microsoft or Google. Now, you've got that. Do you want to be able to transfer that credit to a different organization? So there's a huge amount of things you can be doing with credit transfer, which is why I say, you know, it needs a strong vision at the beginning, and that vision needs buy-in from a wide range of stakeholders. It also needs those stakeholders to be aware of what's happening with micro-credentials. I think some of the surveys so far have said, well, employers aren't quite sure what a micro-credential is, so they don't know what to do with it. They don't know when they see it on a CV what it can mean. I think one of the other things we need to be looking at is how to align this with existing frameworks. You know, there are some big international frameworks, particularly the UNESCO frameworks around education. You know, standard classifications of education, recognition conventions. We've got the Australian qualifications framework, for example. So a lot of things that are in place that people are working to already, and we need to think about, can we align with those, or do we need to make adjustments to those frameworks, and who do we talk to? We also need to be thinking about the resourcing of this. So who is paying to set this up and who is paying to maintain it? Because good credit transfer framework, you know, requires ongoing work. It doesn't just happen. We need to think about trust. Who is backing this up? And around the world, do people have trust in that organisation? Do they believe that it's going to be properly quality assured, properly assessed? And so that sort of takes us on to the quality assurance process. Have we got a robust quality assurance process backing it up? So a lot of things to think about there, but a lot of exciting possibilities as well.
Yeah, definitely. Finally, and very briefly, what do you think the future role of micro-credentials will be, and how do you see the impact evolving?
Well, when we were writing the book, we found that people really came up with four sorts of futures, four things they were trying to achieve. One of them, which the literature tends to sort of gloss over, is that institutions and organisations do see these as a financial benefit that could make them some money, could attract some funding. But more importantly, I think they see it as an expansion of learning opportunities. It can certify things which weren't certifiable in the past. You know, skills and competencies are really moving up the agenda, and the possibility of being able to certify those is important. The importance of developing employability skills for the people who want to do that. Particularly for people, I think, who are moving around from country to country. They need something that they can take with them and that has meaning in different countries. And it can widen access because it doesn't mean committing to a 3-year degree or, you know, the whole year's study as a postgraduate. These are short courses that you can put together and build on. People see it as a way of recognising learning. And that might be learning that you've already done, but just finding a way of crediting those abilities and skills. And also, importantly, people see this as a way of strengthening employment-related learning. And that might be the skills that you bring into employment or the skills that you develop while you're being employed. You know, for example, skills need updating, how are you going to update those skills? And also for career development, you want to move up to the next level, you want to take a promotion, you want to move on to a new company. Microcredentials provides a way of doing that without having to jump out of the workplace and reskill and come back in. It's something you can do in parallel with your career.
Thank you again, Professor Ferguson, for spending some time with us and providing such engaging and impactful discussion. I'm Dr. Jako Olivier, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.